Okay, so today I'll be talking to you guys about war and the conflict that I believe that we as mankind have with war itself. So I'll start off by talking about the perceptions of war, and these perceptions will come from warriors and non-warriors. When I say warriors, I'm specifically speaking of Pericles, who was the general of the Athens army so long ago, and also Brian Turner, who we know fought in the Iraqi war. When I speak of non-warriors, I'll be speaking of John Stuart Mill, who has a quote that we're all familiar with on war, as well as Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. From there, I will go to Brian Turner's Here Bullet, and I will talk about the underlying conflict within that poem. And finally, I will talk about my paper, which was titled The Warrior's Perspective, which I'll get into some of the conflicts that I believe we as mankind again have with war. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of my speech, I would like to give you guys two definitions. One is observe, to notice or perceive something and register it as being significant. And the other I would say is witness, a person who sees an event, typically a crime or an accident, take place. So as I transition into the warriors, I will say that those are the witnesses. Those are the men who are actually there in the battle, who see the true ugliness of war and who remain with those memories throughout their life. And when I speak of the observer, I'm speaking of those who are not actually in the conflict of war, as Abraham Lincoln or as John Stuart Mill. They are pure observers, those who sit back and who go back and can look at the archives of war, but will never have that true experience with it. So I'll first start off by talking of Pericles. He was a general in the Athenian army, and it was at a time where he led the Athens military in the Peloponnesian Wars as well as the Persian Wars. Last week we talked about the funeral oration and the speech that he gave on that day after the Peloponnesian War, going into that war. And I think it's interesting that the pride and almost the boastful attitude that he had as he addressed the Athenians. War is an ugly thing, and there are families who are affected. It is not just the soldiers who lived through those times or who died through those times. It is those who are affected by the war externally, the family members, the mother whose son will never return home, the father who lost his son at war, or the son who may return from war but will never be the same. John Stuart Mill was a British philosopher and economist. He has no true experience with war on the front lines. I think that it is unfair for a man as John Stuart Mill, who, not taking anything away from his education or his background, but it is not fair for him to say that things are uglier than war, because he has not had that experience. And when I get into talking about Brian Turner and the experience he had with war, again, we are comparing the warrior to the non-warrior. How easy is it for a man who has never had that experience with war to sit back and talk about how it's a necessity, how we need it for our objectives as a country or as a nation to implement on the inferior. Then So now I want to address Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th president. Although Abraham Lincoln was not a combatant, he was in a sense on the front lines of the war, of the Civil War, since it was in our nation and in our country. A lot of times the Civil War is talked about as being a war fought in our backyard, where people will go and be able to watch and witness the war as it went on. In Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he is considerate to those who have lost their loved ones, but at the same time he continues to talk about the necessity of war. War is a necessity, but to what end? And how many lives have to be lost? How many civilians have to die? How many soldiers have to return maimed, whether it's physically or mentally, and all that we give up for war? This is something that I think that Abraham Lincoln fails to address, just the true ugliness of war. And I feel like it needs to be a better consideration to those who fought in the war, as well as to those who remain after the war has occurred. Again, to those families, to those mothers, to those fathers, to those civilians. So now I'd like to talk about Brian Turner and Here Bullet. Brian Turner served 7 years in the United States military in the Army, and he went off to Iraq, and in 2004 he wrote this poem, Here Bullet. The The underlying conflict I believe that goes on in Here Bullet is mankind versus war. And I believe that as Turner delivers his delivery throughout Here Bullet, he's speaking of himself who will represent mankind, and he speaks of that bullet that represents war. So in the first half of Here Bullet, Brian Turner speaks of the detriment and the mutilation that a bullet can inflict on the human anatomy, tearing through bone and gristle and flesh. There are a few excerpts here I would like to share with you upon that infliction of Here Bullet. And I dare you to finish what you started, because Here Bullet, here is where I complete the word you bring. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that Turner is giving us the opportunity to fight back for what war is. He has given us the ability to speak out to the true ugliness of war. As I said before, so oftentimes when we give funeral orations or we're giving Gettysburg addresses, it is difficult to reason with people because those men are so proud and boastful about what war is and what it does for the given nation. But I believe that Brian Turner does a good job of being considerate to what war really is and its true ugliness, and that we as mankind need to step back and separate ourselves from that ugliness of war. In my paper, I wrote about how we as mankind could potentially kill ourselves off if we continue this long lineage of war that we have. To some, that may be seen as over-exaggerated, but I would say that in the world today, we're at the press of a button, we could change the landscape of any given geological or geographic location on this planet. That's not so big on exaggeration, because it can happen. So in this speech, I would just like to tell you guys that we need to be considerate of war as we go into serving our country and our military, and to be considerate of those who are affected by war. Thank you.